questions for training today.
All right. Thanks, Nina. Yeah, so I recognize some of you. I feel like some of you have been to either a trafficking training that I've done or maybe like a sexual behavior training. And so hopefully that's a good thing for me, that you came back and thought, yeah, we'll try this again. So I have been with DA Blodgett for almost 5 years now. And before I came to the agency, I did a lot of work with child sexual exploitation and trafficking, both overseas, in Greece and Bulgaria, as well as here locally. Worked with a few different police departments here in the area. I previously worked at the Children's Advocacy Center. And for those of you that aren't familiar, they deal with suspicions of child sexual abuse. And so worked closely with the detectives there when they did get cases where they would pick up kids and there would be a suspicion of trafficking. I would meet them down at the police department and kind of be that first contact for the kid. And so I'll talk a little bit more about some of my experiences and how that plays into kind of what I've learned and what I know. I have, if you've been to one of my presentations before, I went through the PowerPoint yesterday and thought, I should tweak some of these things and update it, recognizing that there are some names of people that had been here before. So hopefully there'll be some new information for you. Like I always say, if you have questions, if something doesn't make sense, please let me know, because the point of this is to be beneficial for you and the work that you all do. And if it's not, then I don't feel like I've done the job that I need to do here. So please let me know if that's the case. We have a lot to cover, and so I'm going to try and stay on track. But please answer or ask questions at any point. I'm fine with that. You don't need to hold your questions or anything like that. Just to give you a little bit of an idea about where we're going, I always like to start with definitions so that we're all on the same page as I talk about trafficking, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, child sexual exploitation, all of those things. I'll use those terms kind of interchangeably, and I want to make sure that we kind of are on the same page as I talk through what those things mean. We're going to talk a little bit about supply and demand, which I sum up into victims and then pimps, the people that essentially are selling, the people, the kids that we're going to talk about. I'm going to focus most of the presentation on youth because that's what we all do, and so I felt like that would be the most relevant. So then we're going to talk about working and how do we help trafficked youth if we know that they've been trafficked, what are some things that are different, what are some things to think about, treatment and building resilience in those youth, what does that look like, and then talk about just some resources and things that if you want more information, where can you go for that, what's going on in our community, things like that. So just to start, the United Nations definition of human trafficking, also known as trafficking in persons. I'm not going to read through that, but essentially the use of force, fraud, or coercion, really those three words are words that I want you to pay attention to, because when cases get presented to prosecutors with the potential of going to court, typically what prosecutors look for was there force, fraud, or coercion? Was that involved at any point? Now, I do want to say, when we talk about minors, if they're under the age of 18 and they say to you, no, I consented to be prostituted, or I consented for this, in the state of Michigan and in federal law, they cannot consent to that. So even if they say to you, no, my boyfriend said he was going to do this and I said I was fine with that, it doesn't matter. It's still illegal. They can't legally consent to being prostituted if they are under the age of 18. And so that's a distinction that we want to make, whether we're talking about minors or then people 18 and over. The challenge that I would always pose to law enforcement and to prosecutors is, what happens at the magical age of 18 that all of a sudden makes it a choice for them? I would argue nothing. Nothing changes except that they're 18 and essentially a legal adult. They're under the same set of circumstances. If yesterday I'm 17 and this happened, and today I'm 18 and this happened, I'm the same person. The same circumstances apply to me. So when you think about the law and the way that that's set up, I would say that it's not victim friendly in that regard, but it's just good for you to know. So the United States, the U.S. Department of State, would refer to trafficking as modern slavery and or trafficking in persons, human trafficking. All three of those terms you will hear used interchangeably. And you've probably seen some of that if you've watched news stories or things. They will use those terms interchangeably. Essentially, they're all talking about the same thing. It seems to be whatever they think will grab your attention the quickest is the term that they run with. And so that kind of seems to be how they determine what they call that. I do want to point out the second paragraph that human trafficking can include movement, but it doesn't require that. And we're going to talk about the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. Those are two different things, and I think a lot of times people get that confused. So just to break it down, I feel like, if you are thinking, what are some things I need to just remember, I find that this slide is pretty helpful. So you have the act of, it's either recruitment, transporting, transferring, harboring, receiving someone by the means of threat, force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power. What you need to know is that it's not within that person's desire that that happens to them. And again, keep in mind, we're going to talk about what does that mean for minors then, who are saying, no, I said that that's okay. Or they asked me to do this, and I said that I would do that. Remember that the consent for them isn't there. They don't have the ability to consent to that. And we're going to talk about if someone is in that place, mentally, emotionally, to where they're saying, yeah, I think this is the best thing for me. What does that mean? Because that unpacks a whole new level of where that person's at, and if a person in that kind of psychological duress can really make that decision. So we're going to talk about that too. For the purposes of exploitation, prostitution, sexual exploitation, forced labor, removal of organs, slavery, similar practices, all of those things. So when we talk about trafficking versus smuggling, there's, I feel like, some big differences here. And I feel like even the media kind of gets this a little muddled. But so human trafficking is not the choice. It's not the choice of the individual. The individual thinks that maybe they're coming to a specific area for a job. They have been lied to in terms of, hey, if you come here, then we're going to provide this job for you. So then they choose to do that. Smuggling, individuals agree to that. They meet up with someone who says, hey, I can get you across the border. If you pay this amount of money, they will do that. The exchange is made. There's an agreement there. Now, can these things go from smuggling to then trafficking and vice versa? Yeah, you can see that. But keep in mind that a lot of times when people are wanting to come across the border and you hear about coyotes or people that are paying people to try and get people over, that's a service that the individual has said, I want to do this and I want you, I know that you are someone that can get me there. So they are making that choice, paying for something that essentially is illegal. So in the United States, for human smuggling, if they get caught doing that, coming into the country illegally in a truck or all the different ways that that's happened, then they can be charged with a crime against the country. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole immigration thing. That's different. I'm not talking about like they're trying to escape from violence. No, I'm talking about this is the way they're doing it, is they're trying to sneak in versus just saying, I want asylum, I'm coming in this way, and just kind of letting it out there. And given the dynamics, the political dynamics, this, I feel like, has gotten really muddled. And I don't want to get into that. It's definitely made it more challenging. But the big thing to note is that in trafficking, the victim does not have to be moved or transported for it to be called human trafficking. Human trafficking can happen right down the road in a house on Leonard. That's human trafficking. It doesn't mean, oh, well, where did they come from before they got to the house? Well, they came from their house a street over. Like, that's not, we don't take that into consideration. That doesn't mean, oh, well, was there 10 miles? Because if there's a distance, then there's no distance required for trafficking. It can happen. It doesn't have to happen. So that would be the biggest takeaway that I would take, is that human smuggling is an international border has to be crossed for it to be considered smuggling. So just keep those things in mind, because what you'll hear in the news isn't always accurate in regards to what's happening with that. There's lots of forms of human trafficking internationally. Sex trafficking, labor trafficking, debt bondage, and child soldiers are probably the most common internationally. Organ trafficking, forced marriage, and begging rings, those things also happen. For our purposes today, I'm not going to talk about all the different forms because we're not really focused on what happens internationally. That looks very different than what happens for us nationally and even in the state of Michigan. So I'm going to talk about sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and then I'm really going to hone in on the sex trafficking piece because that's most common in terms of the kids that we would work with and what we see here in West Michigan and really in our country. So really, again, we kind of have a breakdown of a definition in terms of what that could look like. When I say sex trafficking, what's included in that? I think most of us could say, well, like, they're forced to have sex. Yep, that's part of it. But there's also something where we would talk about like a sense of debt bondage where in some situations maybe someone would be asked to give a certain amount of money and then they couldn't pay that person back, so then that person says, hey, if you can't really pay me back, like, you kind of owe me, and so I'm going to have you do X, Y, and Z to that. They're essentially holding that person. And this is more common from people that are not born in the U.S. and don't really understand that we don't have laws like that, that isn't a thing. And so people are taking advantage of people's lack of knowledge, lack of information about what that's like here for us. Prostitution, that, we could talk a long time, I could talk a long time about that. Because the law will say, as an adult, you can consent to prostitution. And so if you're an adult and you're trying to argue that you're forced into prostitution, I have not ever been aware of a case where that's actually gone through the courts and the victim has come out successful in that, because a lot of people still have the idea that prostitution is a choice. They're choosing to do that. Whatever happens, happens. It's on them. They made the choice. So again, keep in mind for minors, if a kid says, well, I want to be a prostitute or I'm prostituted, you don't get to make that choice as a minor. And like I talked about earlier, that magical age between yesterday I was 17, today I'm 18, all of a sudden now it's my choice. It doesn't even make sense, but that's the way that our laws are set up. And so I think part of that also has to do with our culture, the way that we talk about sex, the way that we feel like whenever adults engage in general, it's consensual across the board. And so I would also argue that I don't know, in the work that I've done, both with minors and adults, I've not met someone that can honestly say to me, I woke up today and what I decided was I wanted to be a prostitute. I wanted to be that my whole life. Today's the day. I don't know anyone that can honestly say that, that isn't then followed by a, well, what else would I be? Because this happened to me and this happened to me and this. As their story starts to unravel, you're like, oh yeah, I totally get how you went from that to this. But I don't know anyone who doesn't have a trauma history who wakes up and is like, this is what I've always wanted to do. So I would argue that that's not something that is really a choice. So child sex trafficking, again, under the age of 18. There's no exceptions. It doesn't really matter. Gender, you could be male, female. It doesn't really matter. And so we're going to really unpack this a little bit more in terms of what that looks like for youth. Commercial sexual exploitation of children. This is something on CSEC that you'll hear a lot. You'll hear this term. And so this is used primarily, I would say, a little bit more in our community and in communities where we have agencies or responses set up to address kids that have been victims of sex trafficking. And the reason for that is because sex trafficking essentially entails all of these four components. You have children that have been prostituted, you have child sex tourism, you have child trafficking, and then you have child pornography. All of those things can be summed up by saying commercial sexual exploitation. So the way that the law states now, I guess, and I'll get into this, but federal law is different than our Michigan state law, which is super helpful when you want to prosecute someone. because law enforcement essentially have to decide, is this a federal case or is this a state case? Because our laws contradict each other when it comes to trafficking. So in this situation, what you'll see a lot in papers is not that someone was charged with trafficking, but that maybe they were charged with child pornography or just a traditional like child sexual abuse kind of thing. A lot of times they won't call it trafficking, one, because it's harder to prosecute, because people still don't really believe that that's a thing, and two, because they believe if they can call it anything else that makes it seem less than that, that's what they're going to call it. It sounds a lot worse to say, hey, like we're going to prosecute this one for child sex trafficking than, yeah, you know, they looked at some child porn, and then like, you know, they did some things, like some sexual assault stuff to a kid. Everyone has heard that. We've heard that for years and years. We know that that happens. It's less scary to communities. It looks better in census polls when you have to report how safe is your area. No one wants to report, well, actually, we have an increase in sex trafficking. Well, that's not going to look good. Like, people aren't going to want to come to Beer City for that. Like, well, some people might, but we don't have time for that. We can't get into that. So yeah, if you think about it, even those of you that interact with schools and other agencies, you don't want to report the worst of the worst. You want to figure out how can we word this so that it doesn't sound as bad, but still kind of addresses what's going on. That's super common. Forced labor, labor trafficking. We're going to talk a little bit about that just because Michigan does have some issues with that. And if you think about it, when we talk about just the farming communities and the migrants that we know come in and kind of work farms and fields and things like that for a period of time, to me it's not that shocking to then think, oh, like they're being mistreated or there's trafficking in the midst of that, or they were promised this amount of pay and this lodging and none of that happened. Yeah, of course that didn't happen. So this is from Polaris Project. So if you're not familiar, you're someone that is interested in kind of trafficking trends and data and statistics and all that stuff. This map is helpful, I think, for a lot of different reasons, but it kind of shows the cases reported in the United States. So obviously the dark red is where the heaviest number of cases of human trafficking are reported. And so you can kind of see that maybe sometimes what you hear in the news about what the border is like and if trafficking is really an issue there, that I'm not going to say it's not an issue, but there's clearly other parts of the United States that have a much bigger issue with trafficking than we do south of the border. So you can kind of see that, and I like this because every year Polaris Project updates this. I'll tell you that I've looked back at the last 3, and it really hasn't changed much, except the areas that were heaviest are just getting darker. So you can really see that the East Coast is really the heaviest and continues to be the heaviest in terms of what they've been able to capture for data. So when we talk about Michigan, just to give you a timeline about where has Michigan been with trafficking, where is it going, human trafficking wasn't illegal in Michigan until 2006. It just wasn't addressed. I don't know that people really thought much about it. I think it was mostly a, wait, what? Like, that doesn't happen here. So, but every time I read that, I think 2006. Like, what was happening? Like, did people just, like, it's kind of mind-blowing to me. 2010, Michigan started saying, yeah, we should probably offer some kind of restitution for victims, because if we like rescue these people and pull them out of trafficking, then like they don't really have any money or a place to go or like any like sense of identity. So we should probably help them so that they feel a little bit better and can actually get on their feet. The biggest change is in 2015 when Michigan signed the Safe Harbor law into effect. And this is specific to minors. And so I think that this is a step in the right direction. I definitely don't think we're all done, we're good to go. So essentially, if